Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And in 2021, Dunn will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we go back overseas today. There was obviously a little thing called the Georgia Senate runoffs that happened in early January, in which the Democrats made history, defied odds, come from behind, you name it. It was historic, in which they elected Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff to the United States Senate, thus giving the Democrats control of both chambers of Congress for the foreseeable future under the Biden administration. And to help us break down that historic win, we're going to be joined by a very, very talented organiser, Jonae Wartel, who was the runoff director for the Democratic Party in Georgia, that is her native state, the Peach State, and she'll be coming on today's episode to basically talk about the whole Georgia runoff campaign and Georgia politics in general. So look out for that. We had a little bit of a problem with the audio at the start, but bear with us, it does get fixed in the first sort of 6 or 7 minutes. Don't forget to subscribe to Socially Democratic on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please give us a rating and leave us a review on the Apple Podcast app. And for all of the most recent updates, don't forget to follow Dunn on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a glorious Thursday afternoon here in downtown Melbourne. And I'm joined on the line from what I would now call the Democratic stronghold of the great state of Georgia. She is the runoff director for the Democrats in Georgia and is fresh off a very, very successful campaign to not only win 2 Senate seats in Georgia, but also to assist the Democrats to regain control of the Senate as the incoming Biden administration begin their big task of restoring democracy in the United States. Jonae Wartel, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And congratulations as well. I am sure that we're going to obviously talk about the Georgia runoff campaign in detail, but you must be exhausted after the last however many months of campaigning.
Yes, I am indeed exhausted, but today was a breath of fresh air. So very excited and, recovering, I will say, for the campaign trail.
Martin Luther King spoke about the hurt and the hope. I want to quickly talk about the hurt and then I want to flip over to the hope, but the hurt being the events that occurred a couple of weeks ago in your nation's capital. There's nothing better than jagging a historic come from behind, nobody believed in us election victory. And then to have that, what I love about that moment is to then do that lap of honour for a couple of weeks, just taking all the thank yous and plaudits for having that successful victory. And that unfortunately was completely overshadowed by the next day, President Trump, former President Trump, that feels nice to say, led a collective of his loyal supporters and white supremacists and right-wing nutjobs and QAnon conspiracy theorists in an insurrection on the nation's capital and the home of American democracy. What were your thoughts running through your mind the next morning after finishing an incredibly amazing election campaign to watch this madness unravel on national television?
Well, you've summarized it nearly perfectly. I, just like everyone, was, flying high after this historic victory. It was really a victory for Georgians and for democracy to then have, not even 12 hours later, to have these events unfold in the nation's capital. And I, being a native Georgian, but having spent a lot of time living very close to Capitol Hill, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing unfold at the Capitol. And it was it was like shock and horror glued to your TV. And so while this euphoric elation of winning an election and seeing the promise of what we could be as a nation, what we could accomplish together, to then see the absolute reverse of that, the ugly underbelly of racism and white supremacy kind of rearing its head in that way, and just bringing a cloud over our democracy for that moment, for that snapshot in time. There was just kind of this tug of war in my heart of being overjoyed at this victory, but then just having to confront once again the ugliness that we saw in those events. And so, I'm still grappling with that really even now. Just thinking about how those events changed for that moment, our democracy. So I will say that, I'm still processing those things in juxtaposition to one another.
I think it's one of the weird norms, I guess, and it's not normal. That's the weird word to use, but just the Trump presidency, you couldn't catch your breath because there was just from the standpoint of an Australian, you'd wake up every morning and jump on Twitter and think what insane things have happened overnight in the United States every day. I think it's going to take time for folks, in the United States and around the world to get used to, hopefully, just things returning back to normal in the United States and politics going on its usual way about just trying to deliver for people in their communities and whatnot, as opposed to the insanity that was the Trump administration. Let's flip over to then the hope, because, watching, I got up at 4:00 this morning, like a lot of Australians would have, and watched the inauguration of President Biden, wow, that's nice to say, and Vice President Harris. Let's talk about the hope. What was running through your mind watching the inauguration today in the nation's capital?
Well, it was like a breath of fresh air. It really was, and it was so good to find less than just 2 weeks after that violent attack on the Capitol, to then see this historic moment happening. It was almost poetic in a sense. You saw this, you felt this relief, really, that, as you said, that you've never felt over the last 4 years. You were always holding your breath to know what thing was going to come out of the president's mouth, what seed of division that he was going to sow in communities, what sort of crazy, unhinged thing would he do in relation to our foreign relations. And that is it's a tough environment to live in. And I remember tweeting right after I saw, President Biden take that oath, to see the historic Kamala Harris taking her oath. I just remember tweeting, exhale. I haven't been able to exhale for 4 years. And it was a moment that I needed, that people I know who are close to this work and do this work every day needed. But it was a moment that our nation needed, to know that decency can be restored to the office of president. That was important to know. And I think that we all kind of took for granted that normalcy that comes with a steady hand of leadership, that almost predictability, but really it's just responsibility and leadership, right? Moral leadership was missing from the White House for all of those years. So I am able to exhale, to breathe deeply, to hope again, because of what I've seen today. And so it's really a great feeling.
So before we talk about the runoff campaign itself, I'm wondering if you could give our Australian audience some context about the state of Georgia and the long-term project that was going into turning Georgia blue. I was in Atlanta in 2016, just doing on a sort of a road trip with some mates for the presidential campaign. And when I was there, I got a real sense that there was a real sort of strong artsy vibe going on in that city. And even sort of watching a lot of US TV shows, everything these days seems to be made in Atlanta, Georgia. One of my favorite shows the last 10 years is Atlanta. And listening to, I think it was a podcast with James Carville and Paul Begala, they were talking about, the changing demographics of places like Gwinnett County. It's become one of the most racially diverse counties in the United States. Cobb County, which was long regarded as a Republican stronghold, has changed dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years. What's going on in Atlanta, and what's going on in Georgia, generally speaking, that is seeing this change, and it's becoming a different looking state than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. It is a changing demographic in the state, particularly in Atlanta, which we know is Fulton County, and then what we call these collar counties around Atlanta, so these suburban counties. Cobb County that you mentioned, which is actually my hometown, it's my home turf, from Cobb County. Gwinnett County, which, as you mentioned, is one of the most racially diverse places in the state. What you're seeing is there are increasing numbers of people of color really inhabiting those suburban areas and creating what I would say is a more progressive foundation for Democrats to really be able to compete there. I will also say that the youth demographics is also helpful. Those areas are getting a bit younger as well. And so I would say that is really why, as Democrats, we've been able to compete in those counties. But demographics, for all that they serve us, they are not destiny. And so it still takes organizing on the ground, doing that long-term voter outreach and engagement. That has really been the story of how Georgia turned blue. And this work began over a decade ago. I remember being a young organizer in the state in 2008, 2010, and seeing the state beginning to change, but us not having invested the time, the resources, and really building the bench of talent and candidates to really compete there. So we saw that people like Stacey Abrams, who is one of my old bosses from 2010, really take an interest in investing in the state. And by that, I mean registering voters, making sure that they were running long-term voter engagement, voter participation campaigns to talk to people about the importance of turning out to vote, to invest in those smaller races so that we could see more Democrats start to create this muscle memory of voting. And then we see, great candidates coming on the board, like Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial race. So it really takes that long-term momentum and voter engagement, and then you create that kind of perfect storm of being able to compete statewide. And we saw how so close that Stacey Abrams came to winning. And then, she didn't kind of take all of her toys and go home. She saw the opportunity to continue to invest in not only, the census and making sure that folks were participating, but then also to continue to register voters despite voter suppression efforts in the state. And so I think that's the reason why in 2020 we saw the state turn blue, because of that long-term investment. So when states say, in the South say, how can we replicate the successes in Georgia? I say, how much time you had? You got 10 years? Because it really does take a long time to see that momentum come to fruition. So that is the story of Georgia. We are a state that's increasingly diverse, but we've also now been in a place to be competitive with the amount of resources and organizing infrastructure that we have in place. And so now we see, Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff, John Ossoff's also one of my former bosses, now in the Senate. And so that is our story, but it is definitely one of intentional investment over a long period of time.
You mentioned voter suppression in your remarks there. It's something that some of us may not be very familiar with in Australia, largely because our democratic system is compulsory voting.
Yep.
What type of tactics do Republicans deploy with voter suppression, and how have you sought to get around those in Georgia?
Yeah. So I think, voter suppression is one of the darkest parts of our history as a state. And what is most shameful about voter suppression is that it and its tactics and its strategy has been perpetrated at the highest levels of government in our state. And by that, I mean, there has been a systematic effort to reduce access to voting in particularly communities of color across our state. That is everything from purging folks from the voter rolls, which if you're not familiar with that process, it's that if someone hasn't voted in maybe the last 2 elections, it is assumed that they are an inactive voter. And so they are purged from the rolls and then have to re-register to vote. And not a lot of times voters don't even know that. They aren't even aware until they go and vote. So that's thing number one. Brian Kemp, our current governor in Georgia, was one of what I call the architects of voter suppression. He oversaw a massive purge of voters in the run up to his own election as governor, and then oversaw the Secretary of State's office while also running for governor. I mean, put that together, it just boggles your mind. You also saw restrictions to early voting, which is one of the tactics that many Georgia voters take advantage of. Advanced voting avoids lines. It makes voting more convenient for working families. A lot of the restricted access to sites and hours made it so people who traditionally maybe had access to an early voting site aren't able to vote and are forced to vote on election day. And we all know that 12 hours to vote, if you've got a job, if you've got kids, is not enough time. So that's tactic number two. And then also vote by mail processing times. A lot of our systems of voting and election administration are historically underfunded in this state. There has not been intentional resource investment. And that means everything from there not being enough voting machines at certain sites where they know there's a lot of high traffic, which creates lines, which creates voter suppression. And then also understaffing workers so that states aren't or counties aren't able to process registrations and vote by mail applications and vote by mail ballots in a quick manner, which causes people to panic. If you think you've voted by mail and you're still and you have no evidence of that when you go to search online, then it's going to create this kind of mistrust in the process. So there are a number of things that have been done both over time and even in this most recent election to essentially suppress Black and brown votes in particular. And so some of the things that are being done to combat that, Stacey Abrams, again, I have to shout her out. She's done some heroic work in this space. The founding of an organization called Fair Fight Action pursues both public awareness and advocacy around these restrictions, because public pressure does work in a lot of these cases where counties have discretion over opening sites, puts public pressure on them. And then also pursues legislation or litigation where litigation is necessary, because a lot of times these counties don't do things willingly. And so where that is necessary, having resources for litigation is a really important part of their strategy as well. So those things taken together has combated a lot of that, but there's still so much work to do in our state.
Looking at the general election,
Yep.
where did Georgia rank on the the priorities for the Biden campaign and for the DNC? So, I mean, you sort of look at states like Ohio and Florida, which had previously been in the Democratic column. President Obama won it in 2008 and 2012. Was Georgia seen as a long shot, or was it legitimately this is something that we can actually win and we're seriously going to put resources into this campaign?
Well, those of us who've organized here and love this state always believe that we can win, right? But a lot of times getting the resources from national campaigns is a matter of whether it's viewed as a competitive state. And that is a number of different factors go into those sorts of calculations. Have we won the state, before? And prior to this election cycle, we hadn't won the state since Bill Clinton. So there would be reason to potentially be skeptical. But I think we knew that if we had enough resource investment and could put enough organizers on the ground and could invest in the infrastructure that you need to be competitive, that we could do it. So while I won't say it was a top priority by any means of the Biden campaign, they did put some resources here. So they did have some organizing staff, some leadership, but it was not at all at the scale that we saw for the runoff election. And different campaigns pursue different strategies, but I think we always knew that if given more, that Georgia could show up in a stronger way when it came to the numbers. And if you look at even 2016, there were states where our turnout in 2016 was actually stronger than a lot of these states that had been at a resource, like the Ohios of the world, where closer margins in Georgia than Ohio, right?
Yeah.
And so, we say to ourselves, we have to continue making the case to get investment, and Stacey and others have been real advocates there. But when we saw that investment, going into the runoff election or for the general election, even with not having a lot of resources, they were able to turn the state blue. I think there was a lot of national momentum there, but there was a lot of momentum in state that people who had been working for a long time made this happen. And so that victory definitely was hard fought and was cherished. And then when we got to the runoff election, our biggest challenge was scaling up the amount of organizing infrastructure that we had now that we had additional resources. So we went from, less than 100 organizers to nearly 300 organizers, roughly. We scaled the largest in-person organizing apparatus in Georgia's history. Never had there been that many organizers on the ground. And so we saw what could happen. We knew that we couldn't do it without the amount of resources and the time that we had. We also had a pandemic, oh, by the way, and then we also had 3 major holidays. So getting people to vote when you've got Christmas, Thanksgiving, and New Year's right in the middle of your timetable required the resources that we ended up having. So we were very fortunate.
I'll come to that question in a moment about fatigue. But before we do, I am interested in the strategy with the 2 Democratic candidates running in the 2 Senate races in the general. Was there a view that there was a potential of outright victory for those 2 candidates in the general, or was it a case of let's just try, if we can get them into a runoff in January, then that would be a great result? How optimistic were you guys?
Well, I will say, not having been a part of the initial thinking, kind of going into the runoff, I was kind of at the tail end of we knew the runoff would be a potential. I was kind of a part of that phase of the deliberation. So I would say that we knew that we could compete in the 2020 cycle. So we knew that was going to mean that we could put John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock in a really strong position. They did pretty close to election day start thinking, because of the polling, that we likely could be in a runoff scenario. So they were exploring that as an option that would be on the table. So they weren't caught flat-footed, as we say. I guess the terminology is they weren't caught by surprise. I'll use a term that makes more sense. But they weren't caught completely by surprise. I think they knew, based on the polling that they were seeing, that it could happen. And so when we got to that place, and also Raphael Warnock was in a primary because of the way that election seat was held, because it was a special election. And so he was not formally the candidate until he got to the runoff, but John Ossoff was already the candidate based on the way that his election was run. So we made quick moves once we realized there was a runoff scenario, and that's how we were able to scale so quickly.
So you have the election in November. Biden wins Georgia by just under 12,000 votes, and you have this runoff. Sidebar, explain the histrionics of why the state of Georgia and your election laws have runoffs.
So runoff elections, so a little bit about so this was a very unique situation that we were in, for having 2 U.S. Senate seats up at the same time. It typically doesn't happen, for all the reasons. They're usually sequenced in between election cycles. So Georgia having a runoff election, we knew would be a possibility, just based on the fact that we knew that the candidate field, the number of candidates that were running, that there was likelihood that they would not garner the 50% threshold that they needed. And in Georgia, that necessitates a runoff election. What I'll say about the partisan politics of runoff elections is, Democrats typically do not fare well in runoff elections because they tend to be lower turnout elections. And so I worked an election in Georgia in 2008 that was also a Senate runoff election, and we didn't fare as well. It was a tough race. And so when you're in a runoff scenario, you're always thinking about who are the voters that we can get to turn out a second time, voters having turned out 2 weeks prior, 3 weeks prior to that. So that's a really big challenge and the reason why these elections are low turnout overall. So we knew we were going to have a challenge when we had a runoff election that was in the middle of December or in the middle of the beginning part of January. And so I wouldn't say the deck was stacked against us, but it's a massive challenge to get that level of turnout in a runoff scenario when you have a highly contested general election. The one other thing I will say is despite that, we turned out more voters than any runoff election ever in the state. And I think that's a testament to the enthusiasm that was generated by our organizing.
How did you deal with voter fatigue? Because surely that would have been very much felt on the doors, going out and speaking to folks saying, hey, you need to come out again. And in the depth of winter as well. I know it doesn't get... How cold does it get in Georgia during your winter?
Depends, with what's going on with climate. It gets much colder than it ever used to when I was growing up here. But it got cold some days. I think we get into like the mid 40 degrees Fahrenheit over here.
So how did you...
but there were days it was certainly colder.
yeah, I can imagine. So how voter fatigue, I mean, was it prevalent in the campaign?
Well, so two things here. One, there was an unprecedented amount of energy on the ground having just turned the state blue for Joe Biden. And so I do think we rode a wave of enthusiasm to a degree. That was certainly some wind in our sails going into the runoff election because people saw what was possible when they turned out to vote. When you see a slim margin like that, it's uniquely energizing because that even if you apathetically went to the polls and because people were bothering you to vote and you voted, you're like, wow, I was one of maybe, 12,000 votes that made a difference. And so we were harnessing kind of this, this energy and this voter empowerment that I think helped combat the fatigue a lot. And so I do think that there was that working for us. The second thing I'll say is there were a lot of groups that have done work in Georgia that had a lot of resources to do voter outreach as well. And being that we were the only race in the country at that moment, there was kind of an overwhelming surge of every group that had resources trying to reach out to voters. And when you're in the Democratic Party, and then there are 5 or 6 other groups that, while helpful, can also be targeting those same voters. And so there was a lot of phone calls, there was a lot of texts, the traditional like people being like, oh, I voted already and people are still calling me and, they call me twice a day. And, there's a certain level of inundation that happens with our voters. But we found that most people were just so excited about the possibility of what could happen that most people kind of said, I'm going to turn out and vote. I'm going to bring my friends, my family, etc. And volunteer as well. We had, we were able to make over 25 million attempts to reach voters over the course of our runoff campaign. And just in the final few days before the election, over 1 million touches, as we'll say, to voters to get them to vote. And so we had unprecedented enthusiasm amongst our volunteers as well as our voters.
So you talked before about you were able to receive increase in resources, in particular organisers on the ground. What adjustments did you make from the general to the runoff in terms of those resources strategically for your campaign?
Yeah. So the one thing that I mentioned when I talked about what the general election was like here was that there were not as many organizers on the ground. And in fact, a lot of the organizing was happening remotely because of the pandemic. And, so there wasn't a lot of in-person volunteer muscle memory, so to speak, of volunteering during a pandemic. So one of the unique challenges that we had was that we knew that in order to win this election, we had to have what we call ground game. So we knew that we needed to talk to voters in person. We knew that the virtual, the text, the emails, the calls wasn't going to be enough. So we made a really strategic decision early on to run a robust in-person program. Now, in the middle of the pandemic, you're like, it gives you, makes your chest tighten a little bit. But we thought very long and hard about how to do so safely, so that we could run this program in person. And so we scaled up the number of organizers nearly exponentially, and pursued all the necessary COVID safety protocols that we needed to do that. But I'd say that's the biggest strategic decision that we had to make early on, to run the kind of program that was going to turn out the number of voters we needed.
I could talk about this for hours, but I need to keep on moving. Yes. One
thing I'll also add to that is outreach to our communities of color. We put an unprecedented amount of resources into outreach in communities of color, because in Georgia, those were the voters that delivered the victory for Joe Biden. And so that diverse coalition was very important to us. So we didn't just contact them in traditional modes of door knocking or calls and text. We also ran programs that were specific to those communities, to go into the local businesses, to go into their places of worship, to go into their communities and have events, kind of bring the campaign to them. And we did so in pretty substantial ways. And I think that's really important because, we see how voters of color impact an election. We saw that in the 2020 general election. And then, oftentimes we start from scratch when we're running a new campaign. Like we forget what helped us win. And so I was really intentional with my leadership team about not taking those voters for granted, because we knew that was going to be a really important part of the victory. So we leaned in very, very hard into outreaching constituent communities.
Looking at the results, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it appeared that there was an increase in voter turnout for both Democratic candidates in those rural, what would be notionally Republican counties. Is that right? Was that a strategic focus for the campaign?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important to remember when you're thinking about the landscape of Georgia in terms of the key Democratic voters is that many of them live in Atlanta, Fulton County, which is the county Atlanta's in, and then the collar counties, the Gwinnett's, the DeKalb's, the Claytons. But then there's also a number of voters that live, it's particularly voters of color that live in rural areas of Georgia. So we saw Southeast Georgia and Southwest Georgia, places like Savannah, places like Columbus, where they're not in the metro, but those are places that you need to still perform very well and turn out your voters if you are going to essentially, I don't want to say combat, but in the rural counties that are white, they're small, right? But all it takes is a number of those counties to really overwhelm the margins that we're running up in those key Democratic counties, Fulton County, Cobb County, Gwinnett County, as we mentioned. And so the strategy of anyone running statewide in Georgia is always, yes, win big, turn out lots of voters in your metro counties, but don't forget about your Southwest Georgias, your Southeast Georgias, where a lot of those Black rural voters don't have campaigns focus enough resources. And sometimes it's a matter of resources, right? If you're prioritizing, maybe you're leaving those voters on the table, but we knew that it was important. And so we made sure that those voters heard from us. And they responded by turning out in record numbers, particularly also African-American seniors, which were a huge demographic surge for us. And collectively helped deliver the victory.
When I had a mutual friend of yours and mine, Katie Parsons, on the show when we were previewing the Georgia runoff at the start of, actually we did it on New Year's Eve, we were sort of tossing up the pros and cons of Trump not being on the ticket. The pros being it could reduce the turnout of his base, and the cons being that sort of maybe middle-class, moderate Republicans that voted for Biden in the general would potentially come out and feel comfortable voting for the two Republican candidates. And I racked my brain over this. I couldn't settle where this would end up. And I don't know what kind of evidence you have of it, but I would be keen to get your insights in what do you think transpired in the end?
Yeah, no problem. So what I shared earlier in terms of the voter turnout that we saw in our key Democratic counties in Atlanta and Metro Atlanta, coupled with the turnout in rural parts of Georgia of our key voters, was one side of the coin. I think the other side of the coin was really that we didn't see the level of the reason why you saw us be able to pull out the victory. That was incredibly important. And I think that a lot of this narrative, this disinformation that the Trump campaign leaned into, and even him coming to campaign on the eve of the election, talking about himself, like, how helpful a surrogate are you? You come to the state to talk about how the election was stolen from you. Not really helpful to delegitimize the election before you're trying to get your Republican colleagues elected, as it turns out. And so I think we did see that a lot of folks said, why am I showing up for an election that's fraudulent? Why am I, people who had been motivated by Trump, who are then being told that this election wasn't legitimate, like, what, that definitely worked against them. I also think that, people wanted to send representatives to Washington who understood their challenges, were in touch with Georgia voters. And you saw David Perdue, someone who has gotten wealthy off of Georgians and their misfortune. Kelly Loeffler, who is insanely rich and just keeps getting richer. I mean, profited on the coronavirus. I mean, come on. And I think you just saw people just wholly reject that and say, what, why am I sending these folks back to Washington? So I do think you saw some voter depression and voter turnout on their side, but I think our folks were also energized by the opportunities they saw in sending John and Raphael Warnock to the Senate.
I found the Republican strategy with the two Democratic candidates interesting. It seemed that they were going to leave Ossoff alone and target their negative messaging towards Raphael Warnock and trying to paint him as a radical left-wing pastor. And they were even wheeling out the old Jeremiah Wright stuff from 2008. Right. But in the end, going by the votes, Warnock was clearly the stronger of the two candidates. Did the Republicans make a mistake here and go after the wrong person?
I think that's definitely one conclusion that you could draw. The races were definitely very interesting because sitting at the nexus of like what we call the coordinated campaign, I had the privilege of working with both teams. And, what I will say is they both were very strategic about their messaging and very disciplined in their messaging. And I think also chose to really run together. And I think that there was value to that. And I think that you could see a different scenario where candidates might say, oh, we want to run our own races, or I'm gonna separate myself or promote my own brand. But I think one of the smartest things that the campaigns decided to do was essentially be a ticket. And so I do think that when you saw them on stage together, when you heard them championing one another, I do think it kind of brought this unity message that was just a complete foil to what we saw happening on the other side. I do think that, a lot of the places where you might have seen Raphael Warnock perform better, it was I think more of a matter of just some of the demographics there maybe being a little stronger and more aligned with like Raphael Warnock's profile or message. But I don't think it was really a difference in platform or a difference in policies. I think it was just that, there was a lot of candidate energy in some of the specific markets that they were able to cultivate and galvanize to drive up the numbers of support. But they campaigned with one another. And I think that was really one of the most important parts of this campaign.
The long term.
And I'll also just add to say, Kelly left. All of their attacks were also baseless, right? While our attacks were backed by facts and their proven records as elected officials, a lot of what Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue were saying were just baseless attacks, and they didn't stick. I mean, you're gonna attack the pastor of Martin Luther King's like spiritual home. It's like that in the South, we don't really take kindly to that sort of thing. And there was just no merit to anything she was saying. And I think that people ultimately saw right through it. And I think it did backfire.
Looking at the strength of both Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff as candidates, and then how shit Loeffler and Perdue were, and just the debates. And I know that there's no merit in democracy, unfortunately. Sometimes the good guys don't always win. But I just was going to be really pissed off that if they didn't get up. I just thought there's such a contrast between these two campaigns that it just would be it would not be justice if they didn't get up. So it actually was quite beautiful to actually just sit there and watch the votes get counted on election day, and slowly they're slowly gaining and catching up, and then both getting over the top was just a very, very beautiful thing. There's no question in there, Jonae. I just wanted to brag and say how happy I was about it. And the good guys won. It made me feel so much better. Like
it's like democracy prevailed. It's like, for once, having the right candidates with the right message, with the right morals, with the right intentions toward the voters, doing the right organizing in the right communities. For once, that formula just like worked. And it doesn't always work, to your point, right? Sometimes you do all the right things and you think you talked to the right people and you think you knocked on the right doors, and you're just like, well, what went wrong? And so not everything on campaigns is within your control, but to see that perfect recipe for people wanting change just prevail over every suppression tactic, every smear attack, it's just beautiful. It's poetic. I will say it's poetic.
Is this long-term strategy that's been adopted in Georgia by so many talented people, including your good self, going to become a campaign template for the Democrats in other southern red states going forward, do you think? Are people talking about this? Are people coming into Georgia and having a look and seeing what you guys did?
Yes. Well, I've definitely had a lot of conversations with people post-election about what we did in Georgia and how we can replicate some of the successes across the South in particular. And I will say that, nothing is impossible. Georgia took a lot of work over many years, over many cycles. There was a lot of people, leaders who believed and continued investing election cycle after election cycle and did not give up. And that brought us to this point. And so, any state looking to replicate the work that we did have to really think long-term, not think next cycle or just a cycle after that, but like invest in the communities, invest in the staff, invest in the programming that helps you cultivate a civic engagement that doesn't just turn out voters, but it makes people, participate in a way that's sustained. And I think that that's a really important distinction between just winning elections and having a sustained infrastructure that you can go back to when it's time for the next fight. And that is my hope for Georgia, that we've seen these wins and we will continue sustaining that. And that's my hope for any state. You have to think long term and you have to think about substantial investment.
Final question. Can you talk about the historic significance of the election of the first black candidate from the South to the United States Senate and from the home state of John Lewis? And those people of faith would probably like to think that there would have been maybe a watch party in heaven on election night with some of the legends of the civil rights movement in attendance. Just talk about that for one moment.
Well, it's honestly hard to talk about that without really tearing up, because I think it moves me to a place of just deep gratitude that I've been able to be a part of this work in this way. Watching Raphael Warnock on the campaign trail, watching John Ossoff on the campaign trail, like watching them really speak to who we are as Georgians, speak to our challenges, say the things that candidates have shied away from saying, calling out things that are wrong, calling out, lack of accountability and leadership, like really speaking to our moral core as Georgians, I think just gave me such resolve and hope that we have people fighting for us. And for Raphael Warnock to be representing his home church, his communities where he grew up, where, he grew up in a housing project near Savannah, and just to see him rise from that to achieve what he's achieved, I think it heartens you to know that that's possible. That's America. That's the American dream. And, he comes from, his ancestors and his mother and those who are closest to him, to be able to walk into the voting booth and choose him and send him to the United States Senate. I think it just means something for all of us and will forever, right? No matter what happens from this point on, like we've proven what's possible, and we've proven that this fight, this work to reinforce our democracy, to choose right in moments when it's easiest to just kind of give up, that work is worth it. And John Lewis, who is a tireless warrior for freedom and civil rights, always used to love to play the song Happy by Pharrell. It's his favorite song. He walks out to the song anytime he's speaking. I just imagine him having like the biggest dance party in heaven to that song, because he truly loved it. And I think that happiness that we all felt that night when those election results were rolling in, that elation, it will remain with me forever. And I know it'll remain with a lot of people who were involved in this victory forever. So it just means a lot. It means more than I can say, honestly.
Well, it was a wonderful result, and props to yourself and everyone else that had put in the effort over the years, and in particular over that runoff. Congratulations. As social democrats around the world, we were all watching intently, basically from sort of early November all the way through to that January runoff.
It felt like a long time, and then also no time at all.
Yeah, I can imagine. But if we're elated, then I can't describe how overjoyed a lot of you folks must be in Georgia. So hopefully you get a chance to get some rest and also now bask in the glory of what was a historic victory. So Jonae Wartel, thank you very much for coming on the show today. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for sharing in our joy here in the States. This was just a great moment for democracy.